The last flight of a kamikaze pilot. Dawn breaks over Chiran Air Base, April 12, 1945. Lieutenant Toshio Anazawa carefully tucks a small paper crane into his flight jacket pocket, a gift from his mother. His hands tremble slightly as he climbs into his Mitsubishi Zero fighter plane. At just 23 years old, he knows this will be his final flight. Like thousands of other young Japanese pilots in the closing months of World War II, he has been ordered to crash his aircraft directly into an American warship. These were the kamikaze, a word that has become synonymous with fanaticism and self-sacrifice. But behind this simplified image lies a far more complex and human story. Who were these young men, really? What thoughts crossed their minds as they took off on their final missions? And how did Japan, a nation with a proud samurai tradition of protecting life and serving with honor, come to embrace a strategy of deliberate suicide attacks? The story begins not with fanatical warriors, but with desperation. By 1944, Japan was losing the Pacific War. American industrial might had produced vast fleets of ships and planes that were methodically destroying Japan's military capabilities. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost most of its experienced pilots in earlier battles. Fuel and aircraft were becoming scarce. In these dire circumstances, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi proposed a radical solution. If a single pilot was willing to crash his plane deliberately into an enemy ship, he could potentially sink it with one hit, achieving with his sacrifice what might otherwise require dozens of conventional attacks. This idea became the Tokubetsu Kogekitai, Special Attack Units, better known to history as the Kamikaze. But contrary to popular belief, most of these pilots were not hardened warriors or fanatics. They were university students, teachers, and young professionals, many in their early 20s or even late teens. They were Japan's best and brightest, chosen for their intelligence and skill. Consider Ryoji Uehara, a 22-year-old student of literature at Waseda University. His final letter home reveals not blind fanaticism, but deep philosophical reflection. I have considered the meaning of life and death. I do not believe that all deaths are equal. To die for the emperor and for the nation is the cleanest of all deaths. However, I cannot help but feel sadness when I think of you, Mother. These were not men who wished for death. Many of their private diaries and letters, only published decades after the war, reveal deep ambivalence about their missions. They struggled with fear, doubt, and a desperate desire to live. Yet they also felt bound by giri, duty, and ninjo, human feeling, ancient concepts deeply woven into Japanese society. The training these young men received at bases like Chiran was surprisingly brief. With fuel scarce and the need for pilots desperate, many received only the most basic flight instruction. They were taught just enough to take off and navigate to their targets. Some had as little as 20 hours of flight time before their final missions. The military authorities believed that extensive training would be wasteful for pilots who would only fly once. Yet even in these harsh circumstances, moments of humanity shone through. At Chiran, local schoolgirls were assigned to help care for the pilots, bringing them meals and tending to their needs. One of these girls, Tomo Kawano, later recalled, "They were just boys, really. Some would show me pictures of their families or talk about their dreams for after the war. Even though we all knew there would be no after for them, it broke my heart." The reality of what these missions meant became clear in the final letters these young men wrote to their families. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, who led one of the first kamikaze attacks, wrote, "Japan's future is bright. I will go first, but please follow this path and complete what I could not." Yet in private conversations, he had confided to a fellow officer, "I am not going out for the emperor or for the empire. I am going because I was ordered to." This contradiction between public bravery and private doubt was common among the kamikaze pilots. Many felt trapped between their desire to live and their duty to die. Their diaries reveal young men who loved poetry, dreamed of future careers, and longed for romance, all while preparing for their final flights. The first organized kamikaze attack took place during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. 5 pilots, led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki, struck American vessels off the Philippines. The results seemed to validate the strategy, at least from a purely military perspective. The attacks sank one carrier escort and damaged several other ships, achieving better results than conventional bombing raids. But the human cost was becoming clear at the training bases. At Tehran and other airfields, young pilots faced their impending deaths in different ways. Some sought solace in alcohol, others in poetry and literature. Many wrote dozens of letters to their families, trying to find the right words to say goodbye. These letters, called yujo, were carefully preserved by their families and offer us a window into their minds. Consider the words of Corporal Takeshi Maruyama, written the night before his final mission. I'm sitting in the barracks listening to my fellow pilots sing folk songs from home. Some are from Tokyo, others from small farming villages I've never heard of. Yesterday we were strangers. Today we are brothers. Tomorrow we will be ashes. Yet somehow I feel at peace. Not because I want to die, I don't. But because in this moment I understand what it means to live. The pressure to volunteer for these missions was immense, though rarely direct. In theory, all kamikaze pilots were volunteers. In practice, the social and psychological pressure made it nearly impossible to refuse. When squadron leaders asked for volunteers, pilots were expected to step forward. Those who hesitated were often met with silence and subtle ostracism. In a culture where group harmony was paramount, this was a powerful form of coercion. Yet documents reveal that some did resist. Lieutenant Yutaka Kaneko secretly recorded in his diary, "They call it voluntary, but when you think about it, it's not voluntary at all. The commanders say we must sink the American ships. If we don't volunteer, we are cowards. If we do, we die. What kind of choice is that?" The tactics themselves evolved as the war progressed. Early kamikaze attacks involved conventional fighter planes loaded with extra explosives. Later, special aircraft were developed specifically for suicide missions. The Oka, nicknamed Cherry Blossom by the Japanese and Baka, Fool, by the Americans, was essentially a human-guided missile. Young pilots would be carried near their targets by bomber aircraft, then released to glide towards enemy ships at speeds of up to 550 miles per hour. Many Americans who witnessed these attacks were deeply affected by them. Lieutenant Robert Schroeder, serving on the USS Missouri, wrote home, "These Japanese pilots, some look so young, dive straight at us. You can sometimes see their faces just before impact. They're not monsters, they're somebody's sons. This war has gone beyond anything I could have imagined." The psychological impact extended beyond the pilots themselves. At Tehran, local residents still remember the daily sight of young men taking off, knowing they would never return. Toki Tominaga, who worked in the airfield's kitchen, recalled, "Every morning, I would make rice balls for the pilot's final meal. Some would eat quietly, others would joke and laugh, perhaps to hide their fear. One young pilot always requested an extra rice ball for the journey. We both knew there would be no journey, but I made it anyway. These small gestures of humanity were all we had left." The toll on families was equally devastating. Parents would receive a small white box containing a few ashes, often merely symbolic, and a letter declaring their son a war god. Many families struggled with complex emotions, pride in their son's sacrifice mixed with anger at a system that demanded it. Some parents, like Shigeyoshi Hamazono's mother, only learned of their son's kamikaze assignment after the war. Her son had written, "Dear mother, by the time you read this, I will have become a shield for His Majesty. Please do not grieve. I go willingly to protect our sacred land." But willingness did not always equal conviction. Even as they wrote brave words about sacrifice and duty, many pilots harbored deep doubts. Some expressed these doubts through poetry, a traditional Japanese art form that allowed for subtle expression of forbidden thoughts. One anonymous pilot wrote, "Cherry blossoms fall, each petal a departing soul. Who asks if they wish to fall?" As American forces drew closer to Japan's home islands in the spring of 1945, the kamikaze attacks intensified. The Battle of Okinawa became the apex of these operations. Over a 2-month period, more than 1,500 pilots took off on their final missions. The scale of sacrifice was unprecedented, yet the strategic impact fell far short of what military leaders had hoped. During these final months, the nature of the pilots changed. As Japan's pool of trained aviators dwindled, younger and less experienced men were called upon. The average age dropped to just 19. Among them was Kiyoshi Ogawa, who had been a literature student before the war. Hours before his final mission, he wrote, "The cherry blossoms are falling, just as we are. But each spring they bloom again. Japan too will bloom again, though we will not see it." The stories of those who survived, either through mission failure or the war's end, provide unique insights into the kamikaze experience. Lieutenant Kaoru Hasegawa was flying his final mission when engine trouble forced him to turn back. The war ended before he could attempt another sortie. Years later, he reflected, "People think we were eager to die for the emperor. This is nonsense. We were young, we loved life, but in that time, in that place, we could see no other path." The kamikaze campaign's military impact was significant, though not decisive. In total, about 3,800 pilots died in these attacks. They sank approximately 50 Allied ships and damaged hundreds more. But the human cost for Japan was catastrophic, not just in lives lost, but in the sacrifice of a generation of educated young men who might have helped rebuild the nation after the war. American sailors who survived these attacks never forgot them. James Reilly, a gunner on the USS Cassin Young, recalled, "What struck me most was their determination. Even as our guns hit them, they kept coming. Sometimes you could see them wave just before impact. That gesture haunted me for years. Was it defiance, farewell, or perhaps forgiveness?" The psychological impact on American forces was profound. The idea of an enemy willing to die deliberately to kill you challenged traditional concepts of warfare. Many veterans later spoke of their conflicted feelings, respect for the pilot's courage mixed with horror at their mission. This complexity would influence how Americans viewed Japanese culture for generations. In Japan, the legacy of the kamikaze is still debated. The Chiran Peace Museum, built on the site of the former airfield, presents a nuanced view of these young men's sacrifice. Visitors can read their final letters, see their personal belongings, and understand them as human beings rather than mere weapons of war. Photos show them playing baseball, reading books, writing poetry, ordinary young men caught in extraordinary circumstances. One of the most poignant artifacts at the museum is a worn textbook that belonged to pilot Shinji Furuya. Inside, he had written a simple question: "Will anyone remember us as we truly were?" This question echoes through the decades, challenging us to look beyond the stereotype of fanatical warriors and see the complex humanity of these young men. The kamikaze phenomenon raises difficult questions that resonate today. How do societies balance individual life against collective survival? What drives young people to sacrifice themselves for a cause? How do we honor sacrifice while acknowledging its tragedy? These questions have no easy answers, but they demand our consideration. Perhaps the most important legacy of the kamikaze story is its warning about the cost of war and the importance of peace. These young men's lives, their hopes, dreams, and potential, were consumed by a conflict that ultimately proved futile. Their stories remind us that in war, it is often the brightest and most promising who are sacrificed first. Today, cherry blossoms still fall at Chiran, just as they did in 1945. Each spring, they bloom again, a reminder of both the transience of life and the possibility of renewal. The young pilots who flew their final missions from this airfield could not have known that their stories would still be told decades later, not as tales of fanaticism, but as profound testaments to human complexity in times of war. In their letters, their diaries, and their final words, these young men left us more than just historical documents. They left us a mirror in which to examine our own humanity, our own courage, and our own capacity for both sacrifice and doubt. Their story is not just about how they died, but about how they lived, loved, and faced their fate with a courage that transcended the circumstances that demanded it. Thank you for watching this exploration of one of World War II's most misunderstood chapters. If you found this story moving and want to learn more about Japanese history, please subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. Your support helps us continue bringing these important historical narratives to light. Remember to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on this complex chapter of history.